welcome to Paranormal UK Radio, created by Irene Allen and Mark Johnson. Twin Souls is hosted by myself, along with my twin brother Ronald Kinsella, in association with the Paranormal UK Radio Network. A very warm welcome to all our listeners. Our guest tonight is David Bryant, author, astronomer, lecturer, guitarist and naval pilot. David is here tonight to talk about his books and research, most notably Our Forbidden Moon, Is Spaceflight Denied to Mankind? He has been a student of the UFO phenomena for nearly 60 years and of astronautics for over 50. David has also been fortunate to meet more than 30 astronauts, including 7 of the 12 moonwalkers. We welcome David in the first of a two-part show with him. Hello, David.
Hi, Philip.
Nice to make acquaintance with you, and I think for our listeners it'll be a little bit of interest for them to know a little bit more about yourself. So I know that you're an astronomer and that you've met with a lot of great people, but tell us, how did you get involved with all of this research, UFOs, and also another of your books, what we'll get into later, Uninvited Companions and Danger from the Sky is another one. How did you get involved in all of this research, David?
It's a long story, really, Philip. I suppose it all started back in 1957 when I was 6. That was an amazing year for astronomy. There were 2 incredibly bright naked-eye comets that year. Sadly, there haven't been any since as good as those. And also it was the year that Russia launched the first satellite, Sputnik 1.
Yes.
So I was at a very impressionable age, and it kind of started me off, and I began a log of every space launch as it happened. And of course, a few years later, when I was 10, the first man, Yuri Gagarin, went into space in 1961, and it kind of carried on from there. And again, I was lucky enough, at a very early age, I got interested in astronomy. And my brother and I are both members of the Junior British Astronomical Association, and
yes.
we were invited down to meet Patrick Moore. In those days, he lived in East Grinstead. We went down there and met him, and that was it, really. That kind of got me interested in astronomy and astronautics, and it kind of went on from there, really.
So you knew the great Sir Patrick Moore. I've watched a lot of the Sky at Night programmes that he used to host, and I don't think he missed any of them. A very eccentric character, but I know that you knew him for most of your life.
Yeah, I wouldn't say we were regular friends or anything, but he was very generous with his time, and a lot of people came into his sphere. It was eccentric. I think it's putting it a bit strongly. He was a very individual person.
Yes.
But yeah, he was an amazing character. He did more for astronomy, certainly among my generation, than probably any person alive. It was great, but sadly missed.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you couldn't help but love the guy, and it's certainly unique is one of the words that you could bless him with. So, with regards, David, to your book, Our Forbidden Moon, Is Spaceflight Denied to Mankind? What was it that propelled you to write this particular book? Because I know I've read the book, and I think it's an absolutely brilliant book to all those listeners. If you want to buy a book, go and buy David's book, Our Forbidden Moon. What was it that compelled you to investigate the investigations around the moon landings, and also I know you deal with rock minerals from space. I know that's one of your passions. But what was it that compelled you to write that book?
Well, I should say, as well as being a meteoriticist, I lecture about and deal and sell meteorites, as you say, quite rightly say, rocks from outer space. For many, many years, I had a sort of twin passion and twin business, which was selling memorabilia.
Yeah.
From stuff that had flown in space, bits of spacecraft, signed photographs, etc., etc., anything that had been in space. I used to jokingly say to people, everything I sell has either been from space, gone into space, or in my case, wishes it had. And I got involved with a group many years ago that actually brought astronauts over to give talks and to do personal appearances in the United Kingdom. And I suppose because of the unique nature of what I sold, I got to know some of them very well. And as you rightly say, it's actually 6 moonwalkers. I think I've met, but 8 other Apollo astronauts. I've met at least one member of every Apollo mission, right the way through, apart from Apollo 1, of course, unfortunately. And, you know, I should also say that back in 1957, which I mentioned earlier, I also had my first experience of a UFO. I had a very clear daylight disc sighting when I was just a kid of 6. And that began my interest in the UFO phenomenon. So the twin interests, really, astronomy, astronautics, and the UFO thing. I mean, there were heady days for UFO researchers back in the 50s. I mean, you had people like Adamski were still alive and productive, you know, and Arthur Shuttleworth and so on. It was So inevitably, if you're actually sitting down with a picture of Martini and a guy who's been in space, you're bound to ask them, aren't you? Like, did you ever see anything? The first thing that's
loosens the tongue.
Absolutely right. Yeah, there's 2. The astonishing thing is that virtually every astronaut I've ever spoken to has at least one story to tell you. And, you know, almost always prefaced by saying this isn't for publication, or, you know, and then they'll tell you there's some really interesting stories. So I guess that's when I realised that, you know, as well as talking to these guys and learning about their missions, you could take things a stage further and use that situation to actually find out, you know, some get the inside line of what really goes on in space, kind of thing. Now, how I came to write the book was, you have to understand, I was a real space or astronautics enthusiast. All I ever wanted to be when I was a kid was an astronaut, and as you kindly mentioned, I did actually go to Dartmouth and pass out as a helicopter pilot. The reason I did that was simply because every astronaut in America at the time, well, with 1 or 2 exceptions, but the first American Mercury astronauts were all either Marine or Navy pilots. So I thought that's the way forward. You know, it was only much later I realised I was 3,000 miles away from the action and about 20 years too young. You know, but there we are. So. As I say, I suppose having been a Navy pilot gave me the opportunity to ask some of these astronauts the stories and after all, I should say you have always to bear in mind that I was a great admirer of these characters.
Yeah. And
like everybody else, I took their stories at face value, and I still think they're most courageous and incredibly patriotic men. You know.
Yes.
But after a while, I began to realise that there was some horrendous inconsistencies in their stories. I guess if you met one of them once, as most people have the chance to do, will have met them once or heard them speak once or twice. But when you've heard them discussing things several times, and you've heard the same aspect of their mission profile discussed by different people at different times, you begin to realise that they're not all singing from the same songbook. And I suppose that's kind of when a few doubts began to creep in, and I can actually pinpoint exactly when my, if you want to put it this way, my concerns or my doubts began to sort of solidify. It was listening to Neil Armstrong talking at Mildenhall. I was lucky enough, I've got one of my customers was an air intelligence officer at Mildenhall, and he got me an invite to go to a kind of private reception for some of the Apollo astronauts who were rotating back to the United States from a goodwill tour of the Far East where they'd been, and they'd stopped off at Mildenhall for night. I think it was Jim Lovell, Neil Armstrong, and Gene Cernan, among other people. Yeah, they were all 3 there.
Wow.
And I remember hearing Armstrong saying, "Oh yeah, I always knew that the Apollo astronauts had made a point of saying that you can't see stars on the moon, which I thought was a bit strange because, I mean, the moon's an airless world. If you looked away from the sources of illumination, that's the Earth and the Sun, you've got the blackest of black skies, you know.
Yes.
And he said, "Oh, you know, I knew that in itself, I always found very strange. Not the least because one of the astronauts I knew fairly well. I've met him several times. One of the nicest of them all, Dr. Edgar Mitchell, who sadly passed away years ago.
Yeah.
But I once asked him, you know, what were the stars like on the moon, in a kind of ingenuous way that I have, and he said, it's all you can do to do your work. He said, you know, you just want to keep looking up at them because they're so bright. You can see stars down to, you know, what would be magnitude 8 or 9 on Earth. Mm-hmm. He said, and you can see things like the M31, the Andromeda Galaxy, and the Rhodes Nebula. You can see the Magellanic Clouds. He said it's incredibly bright. Mm-hmm. Now, against that background, I hear Neil Armstrong, you know, saying not only can you not see stars from the moon, you can't see them in cislunar space. Cislunar space is if you like, the gap in between the Earth and the moon, you know?
Right.
And I thought, this is ridiculous. I mean, that cannot be true, you know. And he was actually asked to repeat that, and he did say, yeah, it's absolutely true. You can't see stars in cislunar space. Mm-hmm. And that started me wondering, really, and I began to note down the strange things that some of the guys said. And even stranger, you began to realise they were actually contradicting themselves several years later. You know, something you'd ask one at one point, and 2 or 3 years later, when you meet them again, they say something entirely different. And so that's what the book is. It's a summation of all the strange inconsistencies, and really some of them are fatal to the idea that they're telling a true account of visiting the moon. I mean, shall I give you a couple of examples?
Yes, please. I mean, you know, I'm already hooked listening to you. Carry on, David.
I'll give you one example, straight away, which is very strange. The very last time I met any Apollo astronauts, I haven't met any for 18 months, and probably that coincides with two things. One, that unfortunately they're all reaching an age where they're either too ill or disinclined to travel. Yeah. But I think it's also coincides with my book being published. But the last couple I met socially was Alan Bean, who's the Apollo 12 lunar module pilot, and Gene Cernan, famously, you know, the commander and the last man on the moon, commander of Apollo 17. And my wife and I were sitting and sharing a drink and chatting and stuff before dinner. Mm-hmm. And I sort of said to Bean, Captain Bean, I said to him, you've never really described the descent phase, Captain. You know, what was it like actually going down to the surface? You know, was it scary? I had it in mind that I once asked that question about what's it like taking off in the shuttle. A guy called Mark Kelly, one of the shuttle pilots, and he said it's like a 20-minute train crash. He said you're just about holding. I didn't know this at the time, but this might be interesting to some of your listeners. I have it on the highest authority that some of the shuttle crews, particularly the rookies, you know, the first timers, actually used to wear nappies, you know, disposable sort of adult diapers. Mm-hmm. But surely purely for that reason. It's actually quite a scary thing, yeah. And I actually had that from Mark Kelly, so it must be true. Anyway, so I asked Alan Bean that, and he said, well, it's just, you know, kind of quiet. And I thought, what? So I said, sorry. He said, yeah. I said, well, you know, it must be quite scary. Must be a lot of vibration. He said, well, not really. And I said, no, must be a lot of noise. And he said, no, you're in a vacuum. There isn't any noise. And I said, well, you know, my experience of flying in the Navy, I can tell you, fantastically loud. The vibration from the jet engine is transmitted through the airframe, and you can feel it and hear it. And yeah, sure. You know. And he said, well, no, you know, he said, in fact, you don't even really know. You're down until you see the contact light come on and the engine stop, and, you know, that's it, you settle on the moon. I said, but you're stood just literally centimetres away from a £10,000 thrust rocket motor, you know.
Exactly.
And he said, yeah, and he said, well, it throttles back. I said, yeah, I know it throttles back. It doesn't throttle back to naught. You know, you're still £6,000 to £8,000 of thrust all the way down. He said, well, who went to the moon, you or me? And I said, oh, yeah, you did, yeah. Of course. He said, no, it's quiet. You're in a vacuum. You can't hear anything. Which I thought was, you know, extraordinarily strange thing to say. And 5 minutes later, when I got the chance, without him hearing, I asked Gene Cernan the same question, and he said, well, the best thing I can tell you, David, it's like sitting in an oil can with people beating the outside with hammers.
Oh, God.
So you couldn't get a more bipolar, could you?
No,
really?
you couldn't really at all. And the thing is, though, that you're if anyone was told that by two different stories from two esteemed men, you'd start scratching your head, thinking, "Hang on a minute, what's going on here?"
Yeah. So you've got the stars thing, where some of them say I remember once. This is going to sound like a hideous name drop, but you did ask.
Yeah, please do. Go ahead. It's your show, David.
I once asked Captain Lovell, Jim Lovell from Apollo 13, the same question. You know, did you have a chance to look at the stars, or can you see the stars? He said, well, you know, I went to the moon twice. Obviously, I didn't land. He said, but you can't see the stars in space. And I said, but obviously you're aware of the film Apollo 13. He looked at me and said, well, I was the technical advisor on it. I'm in it. Of course I'm aware of it. I said, well, one of the points in that film, you know, the dramatic part of the film is when you're returning, you have to make various mid-course corrections, and they make the point in the film that it was very difficult because there's so much debris and ice crystals floating around after the explosion in the service module that you couldn't get a star sight, so you had to use the edge of the Earth to get a sight for navigation. And he looked at me, he didn't know what to say. So it's almost as if NASA has told them, if anybody asks you about the stars on the moon, just say you can't see them.
Right.
You know, and that's how it goes. And I know it's another crazy. I mean, it's only logic. If you look at the amount of the mass of the rocks that some of the missions brought back with them, you know. Yes. The last time we spoke to Gene Cernan, he was doing a talk, and myself and a friend of mine were invited along, and my friend couldn't resist asking. He said, "Can you explain how what the re-entry procedure was for Apollo 17?" He says, "Well, we just came straight in, you know, like going hot and fast, came straight hot and fast." And he says, well, it's interesting because you know, if you look at the senior mission controller, Chris Kraft, in his book, which is called Flight, I think, he makes the point in there that the Apollo capsules re-entering or coming back from the moon are coming in so fast you couldn't do a straight in re-entry. Right. You had to lose kinetic energy first. So he did what's called a skip re-entry, where they dip into the atmosphere, bounce out, come back in, bounce out. Right. And he looked, he said, "Oh, that's just horse." Then another word. I said, "Well, yeah," and then we said, "Well, somebody's not good. Somebody's not reading from the same script, are they?" He said, "We'd like to feed a bomb to that guy." You know, and they're talking about the senior mission control. I'm paraphrasing something like, "We'd like to feed that guy to a bomb." I think he actually said, it didn't even make sense. But he was really angry, and he, after being asked about it again, he, to clarify, he just left the stage, just walked away. Wow. So those kind of inconsistencies, and they're just, my book is full of them. There's hundreds of them. Yes. I mean, some crazy things, like if you look at how long they reckon they, I suppose, the 400 or thereabouts kilos of rock we brought back from the moon. Yeah. Okay, allegedly. Each one is individually wrapped. It goes in a sample bag. That goes in a canister. And the canister, they had this sort of transport system of sort of pulleys and things that was has to convey the stuff up from the surface. And we asked Cernan about that privately at one point. And he's blathering on. "Oh no." We said, "Well, we've worked it out, and even trying it ourselves, given, say, the average mass of what you picked up was, between 50 and 200 grams, to wrap each one, but you just spent all the time you were supposed to be on the moon's surface doing that.
Yeah.
And he said, no, we didn't bother about the transport. We just carried them up the steps. And, people gasped because it's a physical impossibility. You just couldn't have done it. So it's almost like they're making it up as they go along. I mean, Cernan is the most strange character. Of all the missions, the one that probably, one might imagine has got the highest credibility is the last one, because of the amount of time they spent on the moon, like best part of 3 days, But it's point after point after point doesn't stand close examination. I mean, if you look at, before the mission even happened, if you look at he claims to have all kinds of medical conditions, a prostate problem, a serious injury to his leg, and, we were supposed to believe that a NASA doctor conspired with him to hide that from the mission controllers, and the head of the astronaut office, and that the guy actually, was found a lot of the procedures he was supposed to be doing on the moon, he found it difficult because of the damage to his leg. Now it's just inconceivable. As always say, if something sounds too good to be true, it often is.
Yeah, I mean, that's the most shocking revelation. I mean, you've been there with the actual guys yourself. I mean, you're a very clever, intelligent man yourself, and hearing these observing these discrepancies, and of course that's what compelled you to write Our Forbidden Moon.
Absolutely, yeah.
In estimation to all of that, David, what is your take on that? Because I know in your book, and I know it's been 1969 to 1972, and then we never went back. Why do you think that we have never gone back to the moon?
You see, I'm convinced that Kennedy, in his famous speech in 1961, when we'll put a man on the moon and bring him back safely by the end of the decade. I think he was genuine in that, and I think the Americans were genuine in their ambition. But something occurred, or somebody knew something that, in the end, made that made it an impossibility, and they realised that quite early on. And I'm sure you're familiar with the work of an American military officer called Philip Corso.
Oh yes, Colonel Philip Corso. Yes. Yeah,
Colonel Corso. Yeah, and of course, the thing about his book, it's often dismissed by people, but the guy really has got the credentials that he claims to have had. He did really work on.
Yeah,
that's right. Day after Roswell. Yeah. Yeah, it's a great book, and he really, really was involved in back engineering foreign technology, but by which, specifically the role was specifically looking at captured Soviet or Chinese aircraft. But he also makes the point that also involved alien technology.
Yes.
He's just, and he as I know you're aware, maybe the listeners are not, that he contends that the moon is inhabited. Is used as a staging post by alien or EBBEs, as they're called, and that there's a war in space. That there's a parallel space program.
Yes.
NASA is only the bit we get to hear about.
Oh, definitely, yes.
The window shopping. That there's the American Air Force did admit, or right up until the time of the Apollo missions, it was conceded that there was the famous orbital manned laboratory, a military program, but you're supposed to believe that was scrapped about the time of Apollo. But there's no reason why that should be the case, and Corso contends that there are, there's a much larger program than we were ever aware of, clandestine military program involved in this, and that, I came in the end looking at as much as what the astronauts did say as what they didn't say.
Yeah.
I came to the conclusion that, that's hence the title of the book, Our Forbidden Moon, that we're just in some kind of cordon sanitaire. We're just not allowed to leave low Earth orbit. That the highest we've ever, when you look really, the International Space Station, and when it was still flying the space shuttle, just a few hundred kilometres above the Earth. they're barely not much higher than an aircraft would fly, you know. So
as a scientist yourself as well, I mean, when you're discussing this, most people, most of the public, the general public, bless their hearts, always, assume that when someone says they have a space station in space, they think of it being in deep space, as well as the space shuttles, which sadly have now been decommissioned. So this whole idea of us trying to go back to the moon, we're still today met with problems. I know there was a program recently where NASA admitted that they needed to find a way of getting past the lethal Van Allen radiation belt around the Earth, and that made me laugh, because I thought, well, just use the technology you had back in 1969. So
I mean, it's a crazy, this Van Allen belt thing. I mean, it is true to say that the Apollo spacecraft, if they had gone to the moon, would only have been passing through the Van Allen belts for a very short space of time.
Yeah.
But that's like saying, I was only inside the core of the nuclear reactor for a few minutes.
Oh, God.
And again, here's something that's very rarely brought up. The sun is when the sun really cuts loose, when there's a very active surface where you've got lots of sunspot activity, we've got lots of coronal mass ejection going on, then the whole solar system is bombarded with high energy particles and radiation from the sun. Okay.
Yeah.
And there was one of those in between Apollo 16 and Apollo 17. In the August of that year, there was a fantastic CME that swept across the moon. If there'd only been anybody alive, it'd been like being inside a microwave. That's not an overstatement. I mean, even NASA admits that. They were very lucky. I mean, how much luck do you want to... So, it's not just passing through the Van Allen belt. It's the fact that even in the cislunar space, the potential, I actually used to attend an event called Autographica in London, and sometimes you get people there from the European Space Agency, and I'm still in contact with quite a few of those and chat to them and stuff. I think they're slightly frostier than they used to be.
Yeah.
But I remember we were asking one, with no apparent agenda. I asked the guy, "What's the hardest part of the design of a modern spacecraft?" It's like a. They were talking about things like Giotto and so on, and probes to go visit the asteroid belt and so on. He said, the problem is shielding them against radiation. It's because the cosmic radiation and solar radiation and coronal mass ejection can actually burn the things out.
Yes.
As quick as that.
Yeah.
Now, again, I just want to make this point to your listeners, Philip. I'm sure you know this, but I guess most people don't. If you take Apollo 17, that allegedly was sat on the moon for 3 days, okay?
Yeah.
And the guys sat inside that were not wearing their EVA suits. They were just wearing sort of, kind of like space underwear, if you like.
Yeah.
They're separated from the outside by a thickness of aluminium thinner than a Coca-Cola tin.
Yeah.
That would be absolutely no shielding at all, absolutely no shielding whatsoever.
Yeah.
And then they say, oh yeah, but travelling through the Van Allen radiation belt, but they weren't in that. They were in the command module. Now, the command module, the thickest part of its shielding, if you like, was obviously the heat shield at the bottom.
Yes.
But the rest of it is a very thin, 5 to 10 centimetre thin aluminium honeycomb with very thin steel sheeting. I mean, and obviously radiation would pass unhindered through the honeycomb. It would offer very, very little shielding at all. And you bear in mind the amount of shielding you need to protect you. So if you're going to go and work inside Chernobyl or something, part of the cleanup crew, it just doesn't make any sense at all.
No, not at all.
And you're quite right. You bear in mind I'll tell you how high the International Space Station is. It's in such a low orbit that every now and again because of the friction between the ISS and the upper layers of the atmosphere, it slows down and begins to drop out of orbit. So what they have to do is boost it back up again.
Right.
So its height fluctuates according to how recently it's been boosted higher up. So
Right.
if they didn't do that, the thing would crash down in the same way that the.
I must admit, I didn't know that, and I think a lot of our listeners would be very interested to hear that, especially about the shocking revelations of the. Of the space shuttles and of course the Mir space station, how we're all thought and led to believe through the press and all of the programs that they're so far into deep space, which really is nothing less than a fallacy. So going back to Colonel Philip Corso, and in with regards to the Roswell crash, because I know that you're interested in that as well too. Is it your belief that that was actually a alien spacecraft that came down?
This is an unpopular thing to say these days, but I'm absolutely convinced it was.
Yes.
And I think you can. I've got lots of reasons for saying that we don't necessarily want to go into now, but. Again, I was lucky enough to, while he was still alive, to occasionally do email exchanges with the son of the Air Intelligence Officer, Jesse Marcel, with his son. And, he was so matter-of-fact about the material that his father brought in that night and put in a box on the kitchen table and spread out for them to look at. Yeah. And, you're supposed to, again, people don't, this point is not made enough, but Jesse Marcel Jr., the son of the Air Intelligence Officer,
yes.
He himself was an officer in the Air National Guard. He did 2 tours of duty in Iraq flying helicopters. So the guy wasn't, and he was a doctor, a medical doctor too. So it's not like the guy was some kind of hick,
Right.
He knew what he was talking about, and he said that material was not from the Earth. It wasn't balsa wood, it wasn't rubber, it wasn't part of a mogul balloon. That's just horse manure. His dad was hung out to dry, and right until the day he died, his dad, Jesse Marcel, continually repudiated what he was forced to say, in the office that day, that it was part of a weather balloon. It was a cover-up. He said the real material was taken off to other points, Vandenberg, and I'm convinced it was an extraterrestrial aerial vehicle that crashed, one of several that was recovered.
Yes.
And I'm also convinced that the process of back engineering that technology started then and is ongoing. And I think a lot of, and it sounds crazy, but I think a lot of what we take for granted in the modern world is back-engineered alien technology. It's either been given to us or we've back-engineered it from vehicles that we've recovered, Yes. Of course, if we're doing it, you can guarantee other people are too, the Chinese, the Russians,
Yeah, because we've accelerated enormously through our so-called evolution. I think, to be honest with you, we were ahead, and then obviously went backwards through some form of catastrophe. I think it's very important for the listeners to know also that with regards to our technological revolution, I am also convinced, totally with you, David, that Philip Corso was heavily involved with back-engineered alien technology, and that the craft itself was a UFO, because there's no way that the military would spend so much time and attention in tracking down an object that they obviously didn't realise had come down only through Mac Brazel, and also of the secrecy that ensued afterwards. So I believe definitely that there was a cover-up, and since that time, it's legend now, because it's like any conspiracy, the longer it's left, the more it becomes a legend and the harder it is to find the facts. But what interests me also, David, not just about your research and your brilliant books, but also your investigations into and your opinions on the moon's space, and you've got a variety of belief systems, structured belief systems, and all scientific. I have to say, through your writings, you come across as very, to the point and black and white. I just find, most of the listeners were absolutely incredible about the space program. I mean, when you think about it, there's one, that it's one big lie, or two, it's a cover-up. So what are they covering, David? What do you believe that the NASA or the military are covering?
I think the devil is always in the detail and everything, isn't it? And
Yes.
if you want evidence that there is a cover-up, it's simply the way that high-ranking military officers who stick their head above the parapet, metaphorically speaking, get hung out to dry. I've made the acquaintance, and I've done lecture. I actually was the co-lecturer with Colonel Charles Hall of Rendlesham Forest fame.
Yeah, he's a good man.
And that guy comes in for so much abuse from both sides. Both from the UFO, if you like, the UFO community, and also from the astronomers who want to ridicule his. But the guy was a lieutenant colonel, the deputy commander of a base, which he doesn't admit it, but everybody knows was one of the largest nuclear inventories in Europe at the time.
Yes, that's right.
You're supposed to think the bloke couldn't tell the difference between, an alien spacecraft travelling, under intelligent control through some woodland in Suffolk. He couldn't tell that from a lighthouse glimpsed distantly through the trees. It's just nonsense. And there are so many other cases of Bob Salas, the Minuteman missile silo boss, but there are so many of them. If I can give another quick example, I'm lucky enough to still be asked to do lectures. In fact, I'm doing a lecture this autumn for the International Astronomy Show in Stoneleigh Park, which is quite prestigious.
Yeah, brilliant.
And it's great. And quite often, at some stage, somebody is fairly widely known among the astronomy community that I have an interest in this, and so. Somebody will say, what do you think about the UFO phenomenon? Do you believe they're real? And I will say, well, we've got an audience here of 500-600 people. How many of you have served time in the military? And it's usually, people of my age group, usually quite a large percentage.
Yeah.
And you say, well, keep your hand up if you're a pilot. And there's usually 10 or 15. Keep your hand up if you've seen the UFO. And they all have. So you have to look at so you're looking at some concerted cover-up here, and I promise you this is not an exaggeration that most airline pilots, and I've spoken to a lot of those, will never file a UFO report for fear of not just ridicule, but fear of losing their jobs.
Yeah, reprimand. Yeah, definitely. Yes. Yeah.
So what do I think? My bottom line is you don't have all that mechanism in place to suppress something that's just trivial. It's not just a mythology, it's not just legends, it's real. My own personal belief is that space is actually crawling with intelligent life. The cosmos is absolutely alive with it. As a biologist, my first degree actually was in sort of cellular microbiology sort of thing, and my personal belief is that life will exist wherever there's the slightest chance it can exist. The famous Miller-Urey experiment proved that if you just got the right inorganic chemicals in the right circumstances, they'll end up getting themselves together to form amino acids and perhaps even bigger molecules than that, perhaps even nucleotides. So I think life exists everywhere. One of the most interesting meteorites that I sell are called carbonaceous chondrites, and these actually contain these are rocks from space. Some come from asteroids, some are even older. Some of them contain material within them that's even older than the solar system, things called pre-solar grains.
Wow.
And in among them there's a very famous one called Allende from Mexico that's been found to have over 100 amino acids. Now you've only got 20 odd.
Yes.
So the building blocks, amino acids, what fundamentally proteins are made from. Okay, for something to come burrowing in from space and it's full of amino acids, it just, to me, I believe in the principle of what's called panspermia, that life is abundant throughout the universe. It gets transported around on meteorites and products. And there's a very actually growing in belief, really. There's a very well-known idea that possibly human life on Earth may have originated 4 billion years ago with the arrival of a meteorite from Mars, which
That is possible. That is absolutely possible. I mean,
it is not miles somewhere else.
Yeah, there's documentation of a lot of controversy around, our origins, and I do not and have never subscribed to the fact that we originated from apes. I believe that there may well have been an infusion of genetics that were molded from the hominid to create man by maybe something else. But what is very interesting now is that with regards to space, and you're very much involved with space exploration and space travel and the rest, but more people are now questioning. They are no longer interested in the ancient model of scientific explanation with regards to our origins and life on other planets.
Do you know, Philip, I wish I believed you. I wish I could agree with you. Do you know what? As 35 years as an educator and lecturer, the book it will be published in a week or two's time. The latest book.
Oh yes.
It's actually called The Conspiracy.
Yes.
And it's looking at the way that particularly in the West here, humanity or our populations are being progressively dumbed down.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And most of it haven't got. You were talking about people looking slightly more critically at the traditional histories or theories about how life originated. Most people, all they're interested in, and I don't mean this in a critical sense. It's not their fault. It's in my perspective, it's how they've been groomed to be by the government, progressive, successive. Yeah, so they have no interest and no knowledge and no criticality, no curiosity. I promise you this is absolutely true, absolutely true. I was asked to do a talk about the Apollo missions or space flight to a primary school in I'll just say in Norfolk, and it was one of the big primary schools, and there were 4 class groups in there, which is around about 120 kids and their teachers, and I was chatting away, and of course I don't go telling kids that don't voice my opinions about whether or not they went to the moon, because these kids have to pass their SATs, right? And it's not what I'm being asked to do. I never take payment for it, by the way. So I was trying to put a very positive spin on it. I said, now, there were children there as young as 5 or 6, and they were up to the age of 11, obviously. So I said, there are boys and girls, yes, girls too, in this room here, who one day might be among the first group of human beings to walk on the surface of Mars, or even maybe on the moon again. And I said, I have to say, that at the moment, only men have walked on the moon,
Yes.
And you're not going to believe this. One of the teachers put her hand up and said, "Did you just say men have walked on the moon?" So I said, "Yes." And she said, "No, I'd have heard about that." And I could not believe it. And she was absolutely serious, And I mentioned this to the school secretary afterwards, and, and she said, I don't know if you realise this, she said, because I have a background in teaching. I was head of environmental sciences at a high school for 12 years, and I was head of Key Stage 2 at a primary school for 18 years. So I know how the system works. And she said, there's not a single member of staff with a scientific qualification, and the children are no longer required to sit an SAT in science. So they don't really do any science.
Right.
So, and most of the staff, their degrees were not in anything academic. They were in things like, well, one of them had a degree in photography. Others had degrees in the performing arts, and so, in other words, you've got children being educated by people who are, reading up the subject the night before, out the QCA document. So that's kind of part of the thrust of my most recent book, is you can get away with anything if you keep the population so basically ignorant and ill-educated, they'll believe anything you tell them.
Absolutely, and I can assure you of that fact, and it's certainly within the research that I've also done. I can see to a degree what's happening, and I believe that there is intent behind this to bog us down, to make people become ignorant, and shutting their senses off or down, as it were, So it becomes harder. But thank goodness for people like yourself, David, who are trying to open the eyes of other people and minds to the concept that, hang on a minute, there's something wrong here. We need to look at this in a little bit more fine detail, which other people are just taking for granted. So you're like the modern day Sherlock Holmes going in for the kill.
But the strange behaviour of the dog in the light. The problem is, though, Philip, is that people like, I mean, you and your brother are much younger than me. I'm 67 now. As I make the point in my book, it's like that. I'm going to have to paraphrase it here, but the way that the district attorney in the Kevin Costner character in the film JFK, he makes the point, doesn't he? He says, I'm 47, and it's no use for me. By the time this data is due for release, under the Release of Information Act, I'll be dead. So I'm telling my son all about this, and he may have to tell his son. It's going to become a generational thing, eventually. I mean, if you look at, we're going to have to wait. I'm not one who subscribes to any particular, if you like, conspiratorial background to Princess Diana's death. I think she died because some bloke was driving too fast in a tunnel, basically, and but I think there are some extremely dodgy aspects about that, which I address in my book. But if we want to know exactly what was going on and what was known,
yes,
or if you look at the Chilcot report, you want to find out exactly what was known. And was used as the basis for the second Iraq War.
Yes.
You're going to have to wait for 70 years.
Yes.
And even then, you don't know. I mean, I'm sure, like any other researcher, you've been frustrated as I have by the fact that when you do get put in a freedom of information request, either here or in the United States, what you get back is a piece of paper covered in black.
Yes.
And then the press say, "Oh yeah, all the data about UFOs has been released." Well, it hasn't.
Oh, come on. I tell you what, these guys are so clever, but they're not that clever because, most people can just wake up and smell the coffee about what's really going on. So really, in actual fact, the space program, to a degree, seems to have been, in full respect of all those good men and women who are involved with it, they can't help whatever they've been, told to say or to do, because of their patriotic duty, they have to do it.
Absolutely.
But, and I totally respect and honour those guys completely, and the women. But what we're looking at here is a very ugly picture, and a lot of the people, a lot of the public have been duped into the authenticity of what's really going on. And so I think, what we have to do is look beyond that. Do you believe, David, that we actually went to the moon? Do you believe that we've done it?
I don't believe the Apollo astronauts have done it.
No.
I don't say it's beyond the bounds of possibility that somebody from some. It's funny how fiction can often mimic reality.
Yes.
And I don't profess to have any knowledge of this at all. Okay, I've got no evidence for this whatsoever. It's just but I wouldn't be that surprised if. I'll give you. I just need to say something first, which is.
Yeah.
One of the reasons it's often given for the fact that the Apollo program was cancelled after Apollo 17. I mean, there were supposed to be 3 more missions.
Yes.
So it must have really hacked off the guys who had chosen to be astronauts on those missions who didn't get to go.
Yeah.
Is the cost? Now there's 2 things about that that's ridiculous. They didn't throw away the Apollo spacecraft, or not. They already had them. They had the spacecraft, they had the Saturn V missiles, and so what they ended up doing was using them for sort of fairly pointless Apollo-Soyuz joint mission and the Skylab missions, which used the C4 stage. And in other words, they used the hardware, so but adding all that together, the entire audited cost of the Apollo program presented to Congress, the budget, was the whole thing cost $23 billion, which is nothing. Now, when you look at the amount of money that various American politicians have admitted have disappeared and gone off into black ops somewhere, and we are looking at trillions. God. And then when you look at the trillions that have been spent on the Iraq War and so on, And now, I think it would be quite easy to veer money away into this covert space program that we talked about before.
Yes, definitely.
And I'll tell you something else, Philip. Basically, the rocket systems that which we use right up to and including the space shuttle and the next generation that may or may not, take men allegedly to the moon and to Mars and beyond. They're not really any improvement on a V2. They're just chemical rockets.
Yes.
And they suffer the same problem as all chemical rockets. A, they tend to explode from time to time. B, they're incredibly expensive because you can't really reuse them. I always talk about the shuttle being reusable.
Yes.
The cost of turning one round, after each mission, and particularly after the Challenger disaster.
Yeah.
They stripped the things down after they were sent them off to a place at Palmdale in California. They were stripped right down to the airframe, to aluminium, and then rebuilt. They could have built a new one.
Yes. Yeah.
So it wasn't really a reusable system. Again, several shuttle pilots have said to me, specifically, each and every shuttle launch was an experimental launch because each one was different to the one before. They had modifications. Yeah. And, bear in mind, the very last shuttle, the Atlantis mission, was ST-135. So they only had 135 launches with a fleet of 5 shuttles. So in other words, we're not really exploring space, and we're certainly not using modern technology. The technology that NASA and these, the various independent private space programs, they're just old hat now.
Yes.
I'm prepared to believe that, my personal belief, and I've got no evidence for this other than conjecture and from talking to people who probably have got reason to believe it, is that from 1947 onwards, post-Roswell, there are centres throughout the United States, obviously Groom Lake, Area 51, probably Edwards, where spacecraft, alien technology either given to us. I've been specifically told by Edgar Mitchell and by some of his contacts that the first Skype call I ever did, I'm not at liberty to tell the bloke's name, was a very high ranking politician, let's put it that way, who told me that Edgar Mitchell gave me his Skype number. I'd never done Skype before at the time, so I Skyped him. I had no idea who the bloke was, just got this number. And he said, okay. And we were doing a face-to-face Skype, so I thought, well, that looks a very official room he's in. So I said that Edgar had said that he was aware of 4 different alien races with whom the human race was collaborating.
Yes.
And he laughed. He said, well, Edgar gets stuff wrong. It's actually nearer 11.
Good
11. He said, yeah. He said, of those... in all those, he said, some are inimical to the human race. He said some of them are actually helping us in our combat or our because some of them are antipathetic to humanity. And I couldn't believe it. I said, and I said to him, well, can I ask who you are? And when he told me, I nearly fainted.
Blimey.
All I will say is that the guy has now come out, and to some extent, he's come into the public forum and made some of these claims in public now. He's a very senior politician, and why would he lie? And he basically said that that the as we've said before, I mean, you look, the Earth is 4.5 billion, 4.3 billion years old, something like that.
Yes.
The universe is much, much older. Okay, 3 times as old.
Yes.
And there will be races out there which, humanity, if we're to believe, the received wisdom yet again, mankind, human beings, have been on the planet for far less than 1 million years.
Yes.
There will be races out there who have been around for hundreds, thousands of millions of years. Yeah. Now, where would their level of technology have reached? And some of those come into contact with us and say, well, we'll give them a little helping hand. Some of them might view us as, I don't know, parasites or just some lower form of animal life. So that's my belief that somewhere there are programs which are back engineering on using, and that it's not entirely impossible that there's been a presence on the moon, a human presence on the moon, perhaps even predating the Apollo program, but we're not told about it.
No,
I'll go you one further. I'm convinced in my own mind that NASA already knows, that Mars once had a thriving flora and fauna. I'm sure they found evidence of it, and I'm not talking about, the famous face on Mars, which is quite obviously just an natural artifact, but I'm sure they've discovered fossils and all kinds of evidence that there was life there, because, Mars will have cooled down, will have achieved habitability a lot before the Earth did, and like our contention that life will exist wherever it can do. I'm convinced that Mars, could well be another place where human beings have already begun to explore without telling us.
I think personally that you're absolutely right. I think they're going to find a lot of archaeological structures that will prove that we didn't originate on Earth, so to speak, because my argument has always been, if we're the natural inhabitants of this planet, why do we shy from our very own sun? Because we would have evolved to a point where we protected by the elements and so on and so forth. So there was some type of dramatic genetic engineering on some level. But we're coming to the end of the show now, David, and for the first part of the show, and I just want our listeners, we've been really interested, I'm so excited, we all are, to have you on our show, and we're looking forward to the next part also. But tell our listeners how they can get hold of you, David.
How they can get hold of me?
Yes, how they can get hold of you, or they want to know about your books. We know that.
This is going to sound terribly immodest, but if you type my name into Google, David Bryant, or if you put biometeorite, then you'll find that I'm on the front, on the first page of Google, and usually in the top 2 or 3. The books are available on Amazon, and they're available at Waterstones and most outlets. Yeah, and it's the one that we're talking about is Our Forbidden Moon, and that you can buy that from eBay too. But if you bought it through my website, if you just type David Bryant, Our Forbidden Moon, I'll sign it for nothing and pay the postage.
Wow, fantastic. Well, thank you, David. We're looking so forward to having on part 2 of the programme, and our listeners will be riveted by what you've had to say today. We thank you, David, for coming on board, and you've been listening to Paranormal UK Radio, and tuning next month when you'll hear more of David's ideas, research, and about his wonderful books and his new book that's coming out very soon. Stay tuned, stay safe, and God bless. Thank you.